Some cities fall silent after a tragedy. Others go silent before one. In El Salvador, there was a day when buses stopped running, schools shut down, metal storefronts came down early, and entire neighborhoods seemed to hold their breath at once. No formal emergency had been declared. No war had officially begun. There was no public order, no speech, no siren, and yet the reaction was immediate, almost instinctive. People understood that something had moved through the city faster than any announcement could. Fear, not panic in the abstract, not rumor for rumor's sake. A specific kind of fear, the kind built over years, reinforced by bodies, messages, extortion, disappearances, and the knowledge that orders did not need to be spoken loudly to be obeyed. That day exposed the real power of Barrio 18, not just its ability to kill, but its ability to make an entire society adjust its behavior without ever seeing the hand giving the order. That is where this story has to begin. Because the first lie people tell themselves about Barrio 18 is that it was just a street gang. A street gang is supposed to be local, loud, chaotic, short-sighted, a cluster of young men with guns, tattoos, and territory. Dangerous, yes, but still limited. Barrio 18 stopped being that a long time ago. What it became was something harder to crush and much harder to define. A structure, a chain of command, a culture, a fear-based system that could survive arrests, prison walls, internal bloodshed, and state crackdowns, then come back in another form. In some places, it operated like a shadow government, not with flags or official buildings, not with legal legitimacy, but with control, real control. Over movement, money, silence, access, punishment, and survival. In neighborhoods where the state was weak, absent, distrusted, or too slow, Barrio 18 filled the vacuum with its own rules. It told people where they could go, what they could wear, who they could talk to, what they had to pay, and what happened if they got any of it wrong. That kind of power changes the rhythm of daily life. Kids learn early which blocks belong to which side. Store owners learn who gets paid before rent. Drivers learn which route might get them killed. Families learn how to lower their voices when certain names come up. A city does not collapse in one dramatic moment. It gets trained. Over time, fear becomes routine. Then routine becomes culture. That is what made Barrio 18 so much more dangerous than the image most outsiders had of it. It was not surviving through random violence alone. It was surviving because it had figured out how to convert fear into order. It did not need to be visible everywhere. It only needed everyone to believe it could be. And once a group reaches that point, taking out one leader does not end it. Locking up dozens of members does not end it. Sweeping one neighborhood does not end it. The organization bends, absorbs damage, splits, mutates, and keeps moving. To understand how that happened, you have to go back before El Salvador, before the prison commands, before the days when whole cities seemed to shut down under invisible pressure. You have to go back to Los Angeles. Because the roots of Barrio 18 were not planted in a battlefield. They were planted in the margins, in immigrant neighborhoods, in social abandonment, in communities where young people were trying to find identity, safety, protection, and status, in places where institutions had already failed to offer them much of anything. That is how gangs like this first become possible. They do not recruit by starting with murder. They start with belonging. They offer a name, a side, a code, a family substitute, a purpose. It is a warped promise, but it is still a promise. For kids growing up around exclusion, instability, and threat, that can be enough to pull them in. And from there, what begins as identity hardens into machinery. That is the real question at the center of this story. Not just how many people Barrio 18 killed, or how many neighborhoods it touched, or how many times governments tried to wipe it out. The deeper question is how a gang born on the streets learned to become durable enough to survive state pressure and flexible enough to keep shaping life from behind bars. The answer is brutal in its simplicity. Barrio 18 did not remain a gang in the narrow sense. It evolved into a system built from broken social conditions, refined by hierarchy, symbols, discipline, and terror. And the most chilling part is this. The moment people begin to treat that system as permanent, it no longer needs spectacle to win. By then, fear is already doing the work for it. The next part of the story starts where that system started learning how to reproduce itself. Los Angeles, the early architects, and the first generation that turned a neighborhood gang into something with a reach far beyond the block. Every violent organization has an origin story, but Barrio 18's is especially unsettling because it does not begin with ideology or revolution. It begins with neglect. In Los Angeles, in neighborhoods shaped by immigration, exclusion, poverty, and fractured belonging, gangs offered something that looked like protection. For young people caught between languages, countries, and identities, that offer could be powerful. Not because it was noble, and not because it was safe, but because it answered a need. The gang gave structure where there was confusion, brotherhood where there was isolation, rules where there was instability. That is how Barrio 18 first grew roots. The early figures mattered because they helped turn that street-level energy into something portable. People like Spanky were not just members from an earlier era. They represented a key transition point, the phase where the gang's culture, rules, and methods became transferable. Once migration and deportation started carrying people back and forth across borders, the gang traveled too, and it did not travel empty-handed. Yet what crossed into Central America was not only membership, it was a model of hierarchy, territory, initiation, punishment, symbolism, internal discipline, a model that could be adapted to local conditions and then weaponized at scale. Once Barrio 18 embedded itself in El Salvador, it did not stay frozen in its Los Angeles form. It evolved fast. It learned how to use the pressures around it: poverty, weak institutions, overcrowded prisons, neighborhood fragmentation, to become more than a criminal crew. It became an organized ecosystem. That evolution is what separates Barrio 18 from a loose collection of violent men. Real power requires structure, and Barrio 18 built structure. It developed leadership layers, local decision-makers, enforcers, messengers, neighborhood control, and a way of maintaining order through intimidation. Violence was still central, but it was no longer random. It became administrative. It had purpose. It sent messages. It protected revenue. It enforced obedience. And symbols became a major part of that system. In Barrio 18, tattoos were never just aesthetic choices. They could signal rank, loyalty, experience, and belonging. They could also function as warnings. In a world where identity is policed through fear, even symbols become controlled property. A mark on skin can serve as proof, provocation, or betrayal. That is why the detail of a 15-year-old killed over a fake tattoo hits so hard. It shows just how total the gang's logic could become. This was not only about controlling streets, it was about controlling meaning. In ordinary life, a tattoo is personal. In the world Barrio 18 built, it could become an offense punishable by death. The body itself became contested ground. That is not street chaos. That is authoritarian behavior on a neighborhood scale. As the gang grew, it produced different kinds of leaders. El Viejo Lin reflected one kind of authority, the organizer, the architect of order inside a violent structure. Piwa represented a harder edge, a more openly brutal escalation. El Pinky suggested a quieter but still disciplined form of command. El Colocho stood closer to the street-level war, where leadership had to be proven block by block, in territory, confrontation, and fear. These were not interchangeable personalities. Together, they revealed something larger. Barrio 18 had become a system with multiple command points and multiple styles of power. Then came the split. The division between revolucionarios and sureños was not a side note. It was one of the gang's most revealing fractures. From the outside, both factions still belonged to the same larger identity. But from the inside, the split created suspicion, rivalry, and bloodshed. It exposed a truth common to many violent organizations. Internal division does not always weaken them immediately. Sometimes it makes them even more dangerous. When loyalty gets contested, cruelty becomes a test. Members have to prove themselves harder. Discipline becomes harsher. Punishment gets more extreme. Violence no longer moves only outward toward enemies or the public. It moves inward too. And when that happens, everyone inside the system becomes more disposable. Then prison enters the story, not as the end of power, but as one of the places where power gets reorganized. That is one of the darkest ironies in the rise of Barrio 18. The prison system, designed to contain violence, often ended up concentrating it. Behind bars, leaders could consolidate authority, rebuild lines of communication, define internal order, and continue influencing the outside. Prison could separate bodies, but not necessarily sever command. Once that happens, the whole framework changes. A gang no longer needs to dominate only through visible street presence. It can start functioning like a network, less theatrical, more disciplined, harder to read, harder to dismantle. Orders can move without public displays. Violence can be triggered without leaders standing in the open. The organization becomes more resilient precisely because it learns to depend less on visibility. By that point, governments were no longer dealing with random street violence. They were dealing with an adaptive criminal structure rooted in neighborhoods, prisons, youth identity, local economies, and fear. Arrests could damage it. Raids could disrupt it. But none of that guaranteed collapse. Barrio 18 had figured out a principle that helps violent systems endure. Never let the organization depend entirely on one face. Make the structure itself the real boss. That is why this story is bigger than law enforcement. It is about what happens when social failure, prison dynamics, gang culture, and political weakness all start feeding the same machine. It is about how something that begins on the street can become embedded deep enough that force alone cannot cleanly remove it. And that leads to the bleakest turning point of all. The moment the state starts to realize that brute pressure may not be enough, and begins considering what it means to negotiate with something it cannot fully crush. What does it say about a country when the government starts dealing with gangs as if they are political actors? That is the moral trap at the heart of La Tregua. On paper, a truce can be framed as practical. Killings go down. Public panic eases. Officials can point to fewer bodies and claim some version of progress. For communities exhausted by nonstop violence, even temporary relief can feel like oxygen. And that is what makes the issue so dangerous. Because once a government starts trading for calm, the question is no longer just whether violence has dipped. The question becomes, what was traded for it? That is where the story gets darker, because it moves beyond police and gangsters and into the gray zone where public order, political survival, and criminal power start touching each other. A government that negotiates, directly or indirectly, is admitting something, whether it says it out loud or not. The group on the other side has enough leverage to matter. That is not a small admission. It means the state is no longer dealing only with criminals to be hunted down. It is dealing with an embedded force that can shape outcomes. For ordinary people, a lull in violence might feel like hope. For Barrio 18, it can mean something else entirely. Time. Time to regroup. Time to reestablish command. Time to move people, money, and influence. Time to recover from pressure and prepare for whatever comes next. Violent organizations built on survival do not interpret pauses the way civilians do. They see openings where everyone else sees relief. That is why leadership losses, by themselves, never resolved the problem. Some leaders were imprisoned, some were killed, some vanished into the system. But Barrio 18 kept going because by then it had already learned how to outgrow individual personalities. The organization had matured into something larger than any one name. That is what makes figures like El Mudo so significant. He represents a later form of power, less flashy, less dependent on public myth, and in some ways more dangerous because of that. A quieter kind of control. A leader whose strength does not come from constantly being seen, but from being able to move the machine without needing a spotlight. That is a higher stage of criminal evolution. Once command can be exercised through intermediaries, codes, routines, prison links, and fear already embedded in daily life, visibility becomes optional. The gang does not need to advertise itself the way it once did. It can become less obvious and more durable at the same time. That is why government crackdowns so often fail to feel final. You can flood streets with police. You can build bigger prisons. You can pass tougher laws. You can arrest hundreds. But if the conditions that keep feeding the organization remain in place, poverty, abandonment, social fragmentation, broken family structures, distrust of institutions, prison systems that harden gang identity instead of breaking it, then the machine still has material to work with. That is the wider tragedy of Barrio 18. This is not just a crime story. It is a story about what fills the void when institutions fail at the most local level. It is a story about kids searching for identity and protection in places that ultimately consume them. It is a story about a state that can punish, but often cannot repair. And it is a story about how fear, once normalized, becomes part of the environment. That may be Barrio 18's greatest achievement, not the number of members it recruited, not the amount of territory it controlled, not even the body count that made its name feared. Its greatest achievement was psychological. It taught people how to live around it. Once that happens, a gang becomes more than a security threat. It becomes part of the landscape. It shapes how people move, talk, dress, work, trust, and survive. Content does not need to dominate every hour of every day. It just needs everyone to remember that it can. From Los Angeles to El Salvador, from neighborhood identity to prison command, from tattoos and initiation to back-channel political arrangements, Barrio 18 followed a brutal path. It started as a gang on the margins. It became a structure powerful enough to force police, prisons, politicians, and entire communities to organize themselves in response to it. And that leads to the most unsettling conclusion of all. A gang is dangerous when it can kill, but it becomes a long-term nightmare when it no longer has to show itself for people to keep living by its rules.